Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for July 30th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined by John Hogoboom, Jim Clausing, and John Markley. Welcome, guys. I'm Brian Rexroad. And why don't we talk, I guess we often talk about denial of service attacks. I guess this is a little bit of a different perspective. And John Hogoboom, what can you tell us?
Hey, Brian, thanks. So, yeah, actually I have a couple of stories today related to distributed denial of service attacks. The first one is from Arbor. Arbor put out a report. They're a big DDoS mitigation hardware provider. And they've noticed the trend, as we all have, that the amount of distributed denial of service attacks and the size of them have increased greatly over the past probably 12 months or so. So some of the numbers that they have here is that the attack size is up by 43% so far this year, and almost 50% of the attacks are over 1 gigabits now in this year. And when you look at the proportion of attacks in the 2 to 10 gigabit range, it's more than double from what it had been. And the proportion of attacks now over 10 gigabits has increased by about 41% year to date. So the size of the attacks, much larger than they had been previously. The other interesting thing, another number, the attack durations are trending shorter. 86% now last less than 1 hour. So that's another interesting thing, in that it's more traffic, more attack traffic, but less duration in time that they're seeing. And I've also noticed that the packets per second attack sizes seem to be trending downward as well, which is a reverse of what they had been seeing between 2011 to 2012. That's kind of the first story about what the trends are. And I actually have a slide in a little bit on some of our visibility, but I wanted to jump to another story as well, unless you guys had some comments on this one.
Well, I think this is probably worth talking about a little bit here, John. I had a couple of questions. I guess, first of all, I read another report by Prologue, and it seemed to have some similarities in some of the statements, but I think there was perhaps some differences as well. And I'm wondering if it maybe perhaps is a little bit of a different perspective. So whereas Arbor, I think, is looking at sort of passively what's going on based on information that's in some cases volunteered by a variety of organizations, and sort of analyzing flow activity. They have basically a contribution program where data can be anonymized and provided to them, and I think they're basing this on that analysis, whereas I think Prologue as a DDoS defense provider is perhaps looking at specific attacks for those that have subscribed to protection services. And this is somewhat conjecture on my part, but there may be some differences in the clients that have subscribed to a protective service versus ones that are perhaps getting attacked and haven't necessarily been protected. Anyway, one discrepancy is I think they said that the length of attacks is actually going up, whereas this one I think is saying the length, the duration of attacks is going down. And that may be one of those fundamental differences, that a different perspective in the analysis. And then similarly speaking, I think the packet per second sizes seem to be a little different as well. I think this one is saying it's trending downward. One of the things that at least I've observed in particularly the DNS amplification attacks, particularly when you're doing flow analysis, is you need to take into account not just the packets themselves, but that is the port 53 activity, but also the fragmented packets, which don't really register in flow data as port 53. They register in other ways. So that could be one of the discrepancies here, that is an increase in that type of attack or, reflective attacks, which could cause packet fragmentation and may not be getting accounted for in terms of overall packet sizes. Again, just some guesses on my part and to why the reports may be saying something a little bit different.
Right. And like you said, I think, and this is kind of speculative on my behalf as well, but I think Prolexic might have a slightly different view, maybe a little bit more tailored to certain types of customer sets.
Yep.
Hence their difference in how they're seeing their patterns emerge. So interesting. One thing is clear is that the number of attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, is definitely up. And we've seen some of the largest attacks, within the past 6 to 12 months than I don't think we ever have before, and certainly more frequently. So
the question that I have, and I don't think we have the data to answer it, is why the attacks would be getting shorter. It would seem to me the bad guys wouldn't have any particular reason to shorten their attacks unless they were getting mitigated or something. So that one strikes me as odd.
Yeah, and good point there, Jim. That was one of the things that was different between the two reports, whereas Prolexic said they were generally going longer, and their conjecture was that the attackers are less concerned about discovery of the botnets, presumably because the botnet operators feel that they have more resilient infrastructure and are basically, can't be affected so much. That would be one, that was their perspective. My impression is that and that may possibly be the case where there's a relatively strong motivation to perform those denial of service attacks, whereas in the case of Arbor more passively looking at things, I think, at least in our observations, we've seen many, many more attacks that are relatively short, that is less than an hour, that appear to be just what I would describe as nuisance attacks, or basically trying to disrupt, in fact, targeting end consumers as opposed to businesses. My impression is it's related to gaming activities in many cases. A lot of times they're even targeting games. I think what they're trying to do is basically get one up on their competitors. But again, that's not a scientific study. That's a sort of a casual observation.
Yeah, and probably we just don't have enough data to figure that out at this point. So.
It's very difficult to determine the motivations of attacks. Yes.
So the other story I had was also somewhat related to denial of service attacks. And this is a story about ISC, who makes the bind software, which is basically the DNS resolver software that most people use. There are some other vendors out there as well, but they're one of the primary software providers in that space. And they recently added a new feature, the RRL, or Response Rate Limiter feature, to their ISC bind software, which basically is going to help with these DNS amplification attacks, or at least that's the theory. So they've done some testing on this. I believe it's ready to be released. I don't know if it's available today or not, but within the near term it will be available for people to deploy on their DNS servers. And, the basic gist here is with these DNS amplification attacks, which we've talked about before, or reflection attacks, they're basically spoofing the source IP, sending it to a whole handful of these open DNS resolvers out there on the Internet. Those open DNS resolvers respond back to the spoof source IP, which is going to be some victim that they actually are targeting there. And since it's UDP, the packets, they can spoof the source IP on them and have the response delivered to whoever they want it to. So this is going to allow the bind software to kind of see these patterns and rate limit the amount of responses it's sending back to a single source, especially if it's going to be the same type of query over and over again, I would imagine. So most attacks are like that, where it's just one single query that just keeps, being queried for and responded to. So that's a good sign. Be interesting to see how this works in the future once people start rolling it out. I guess my take on this is we know there's tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of open DNS resolvers out there. If these people who are running these and the chances are they don't know that they're running their DNS server in an open configuration, and they don't, they're not even aware of it. Are they going to even be aware to upgrade their software to begin with so they can, protect themselves from being a third party of this type of attack? Hopefully, they'll get the word out there somehow, but, this should help alleviate that, assuming people upgrade their software on their bind servers.
how much configuration does it take to enable this feature? That I haven't seen yet. I haven't looked to see if my version of Bind has that yet, but it's something that will take some work on the part of the guys operating the DNS servers to actually turn this on, I suspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, it's actually even a bit more than that. I think you have to. I don't think there's any automation behind what the rate limiting should be. So you have to have some idea what is an acceptable rate for queries, and that would, obviously require some, perhaps first some understanding of what the load is on your system, and which you probably should have some insight into anyway. And actually, this has been out. I don't know if there have been any significant modifications, but this basic feature has been out in a beta form for quite some time, better than 6 months. And I think we're actually using it in our environments in some places as well. The benefit here is it does provide the rate limiting to, basically keeping some state space on the query activity. The drawback is, and you have to be very careful about this, is that once you start doing rate limiting, it does, in fact, limit the amount of queries a particular source can do against your DNS server. And the consequence of that is it could facilitate somewhat of a denial of service attack. So you have to be a little bit careful about how it gets used, but it is a tool that is most likely helpful in most attack scenarios.
It would be really interesting to see if there was some way to measure the take rate, not only for Bind versions, because I know that that implementing a new version of Bind and anything in DNS kind of takes a little bit of that rocket science. You have to kind of know what you're doing, so people don't deploy new versions. So not only what's the take rate on a new version, but what's the take rate on the RRL module? It's probably going to be pretty slow for the next year plus.
Possibly so. I guess to some extent it depends on how well folks recognize the need for it. Like, for example, back in 2008 when the what I like to call the Kaminsky patch, basically the patch to help at least minimize the threat of DNS cache poisoning, there was a reasonable amount of publicity around that, and the patching activity was pretty aggressive. And so folks, that did get into place fairly well. I don't think this is going to get the same level of attention, but, it is a sort of a testimony to the fact that that can get done when it needs to. Good point, John. Absolutely.
And just to borrow one of Brian's slides from last week, he kind of talked about DNS reflection attacks and what we've been seeing in our data. And you can clearly see that there's, a pretty low noise floor through the first half of 2012 here and even back into 2011. And then in 2012, around the July timeframe probably, we started to see more and more, and it's accelerated. It's a little dipped from what it, had peaked out at in the middle of March here maybe. But, it's definitely much higher than it had been, way back in the early 2012. So there's definitely been a shift or a trend towards using DNS reflection as a means to engage in DDoS attacks. So it's a module that's definitely in need of being deployed as widely as possible to get these open resolvers cleaned up so that they can't be used in these attacks.
All right. Well, thank you, John. There's obviously some good discussion on denial of service attacks. So let's transition over to Jim here. Jim, what's going on with the malware? I don't even know how to introduce this. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah. I came across this story on McAfee's blog before I went on vacation, but I thought it was interesting, as somebody who analyzes malware every day, it's interesting to me what steps the attackers will go to try to evade detection. And they will often make some minor modifications to the actual opcodes that get used to try to make subtle changes that are functionally equivalent to older versions because, the signatures come out, they want to, do the polymorphic kind of stuff to evade signatures so the binary changes each time. But this one is a little different, and especially since in a previous life I used to write compilers, this one it was kind of interesting to me. One of the new techniques that McAfee has discovered is they'll try to adjust the procedure prologue and epilogue, that is the code that the compiler generates at the beginning and end of a function to set up the stack space for a function to operate on. There are a relatively small number of conventions, code sequences that the compilers normally generate at the beginning and end of a function, and so the antivirus software will often scan through looking for these so that it can isolate a function to look for particular code patterns. And so what this technique does is they actually modify the code that the compiler generates for the procedure prologue and epilogue, which in some cases makes it difficult for either the antivirus scanner or the disassembler especially to be able to find the beginning and end of the procedure for those of us who dig into these things on a regular basis and look at that. So I thought it was an interesting technique. The antivirus vendors are starting to be able to detect this, but it was an interesting technique to try to evade the folks like me who do malware analysis on a regular basis. It's subtle modifications that's functionally equivalent what the compiler would generate, but it's different enough that some of our automated techniques won't work in the same way.
Perhaps this is supposed to be obvious, but is this implying that the malware writers are also writing their own compilers to generate their code?
Not necessarily. They can take what the compiler generated and do a post-processing pass on it. But they are obviously they do understand what the compiler is generating for them well enough that they can write code that goes in and modifies it. So, I doubt that they're writing their own compilers. There are good enough ones out there, but they do understand machine code at that level to be able to write some program that goes through and post-processes it to make these kinds of changes.
Well, it's certainly interesting in the sense that it gives you yet another sort of insight into the level of sophistication that's being built into this malware and how, in this case, they're attempting to be elusive. And curiously, we just spent some time talking about denial of service attacks, which tend to be, either trying to draw attention. They're certainly not hiding their activities, where this is a case where they're highly motivated to hide under the covers and not be noticed.
Or the denial of service is against the malware researchers who have to spend more time figuring out what's going on. The resource they're exhausting is the researcher.
In the malware space, this type of thing, previously they had been doing things with packers, and they still do this today. So they might take an executable and pack it with something. Even more recently, maybe last year, I think, I started to see some people that actually write their own packers that they encrypt the payload, and then it actually encrypts it with the packer encrypts the real payload with a very weak encryption key that when it goes to run the program and unpack, it actually breaks its own key. It goes and tries to brute force its own key to unpack the payload. So from an analysis standpoint, you really have to iterate this thing. You couldn't do any kind of static analysis to figure out what the heck's going on here. which I thought was an interesting technique in terms of, trying to hide what your actual payload code is from, these antivirus, agents and whatnot.
Interesting. I used to have a sort of a conspiracy theory that there were extra steps added into software over time to just, kind of load down your machine so you'd have to buy a new one, with a faster processor to pick up the slack where the software. But apparently that's not needed. They're finding lots of ways to consume your machine by, for example, cracking your own packs.
Yeah.
All right. Well, very interesting story there, Jim. In fact, again, I think it just gives us another insight into the level of sophistication into this attack activity. It's obviously well-funded in terms of the effort going into it. And with that, let's talk with John here. I think you were going to share with us some basic tips on how to protect ourselves against phishing. Is that right?
That's exactly right, Brian. It's interesting. We all, as members of the computer environment, right? We get calls all the time to help people out, and some of the most common things that I do is, you look at an email, you look at something, and you pretty much know, hey, this is legit, this is not legit, or at least it's, maybe on the close to the legit side. And, I find, that, with my friends and with relatives and with, even neighbors, sometimes just going over some of these basic tips, and some of them are not quite so basic, just things that you see an email and you think to yourself, hey, this is okay. So I thought this would take a chance. I got 4 examples that just came into my mailbox within the last couple of weeks that I thought would be great to share here.
Okay.
The first one was one that came in as probably the most basic one, and for maybe those of you who are on Yahoo Mail, they're doing a conversion from what they call classic to more web-based, more GUI-based type environment. So we're getting a lot of email today about the the Yahoo Mail conversion. And so this was one that I recently got, was one, and it actually came from Ronster, and I don't know a Ronster, by the way. And so I saw this mail, and I thought, this, obviously I don't want to just delete it, so I saved a bunch of these, and this was one of the first ones. And what's interesting is you look at this and you think to yourself, what are the flags? What tells me that this is legit or not legit? Mm-hmm. So some of the first things, obviously from Ronster, as in this example, it's an odd alias. It's not an alias I'm familiar with. It's not somebody obviously associated with, with AT&T or Yahoo. So it kind of, that's the first flag went up. Second flag is that there's no to. If you look at this email, and these are hard to see sometimes on a mobile device, but on a web browser or even an Outlook or other mail client, you might be able to see this. It doesn't have a to, so it tells me that they probably malformed a little bit of this email. There's a big blank, kind of the third indicator there, between 2 gray bars. I'm not sure what that was for in this mail, but it does come clear in some of the later mails. Cases, AT&T, you'll notice AT&T Yahoo ! Mail. But in the text of the body of the email, you'll notice that they don't capitalize AT&T, which sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But they miss the exclamation point after Yahoo. And not to give the phishing writers any tips, but we always see Yahoo ! It's always there. So that was another indicator to me that this is probably not quite legit. Kind of go on, those Internet Explorer 7, Firefox 3, Safari 4, Chrome 5 are newer. Although it does say are newer, it just seems kind of odd to mention such older products. And yes, we probably do that in a lot of our correspondence, but it just still kind of just looks a little strange to me. The key element, though, on all these phishing emails is this click here to upgrade now. And I want to tell everybody, and everybody should know this, right? You don't click there. Right? You never, ever click on those links. Don't do it. Don't think about it. Don't even contemplate it, remotely. But if you mouse over it, and I don't have a great example on this slide, but if you mouse over it, you'll actually see in most of your browsers, you'll see that link in for example, in Firefox or Internet Explorer. It'll actually tell you what that link points to. Mm-hmm. And typically, if it's not something that looks legit, or if it comes up, something .ru, for example, or something that's not .com, .net, and not the AT&T or Yahoo environment, you pretty much know that they're trying to get you to click somewhere you shouldn't go.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the basic ones. So then about a couple days later, I get another email, and this other email is kind of similar. It's got this very similar of the same traits, but they changed it a little bit. And so the key element that you can see is first off, the subject line is corrupted. This is the subject line is XSD, so maybe I was a trial. So the key again is are pretty much the same, but XSD subject line. If you'll notice, they actually have a from it looks legit. AT&T, Yahoo, My Account Services looks legit. In this case, you can click the plus. At least that's the indicator you can do here, or expand that, and you'll see if you did it, you'll actually see that the email address came from Ronster, or somebody else not legitimate. If it's not a legitimate email address, it'll actually say, AT&T, Yahoo Mail, or some other legitimate email case. And in this case, it did not. It was not legitimate. So that was a good indication. And you can do that on your mobile device. You can expand that without actually sending an email, sending up any kind of flag. The to address actually showed up on this example, so they fixed whatever bug was there. They also fixed the graphic that was supposed to be between the two gray bars. In this case, it was a Bell South graphic. Not something we use a whole heck of a lot anymore, but it is a valid graphic, I would assume. However, I'm not a Bell South employee, or a customer, excuse me. I'm not a Bell South customer, and so from this perspective, it's misdirected. It's sending it to a Bell South, obviously .net account, but it's still not clear. You'll notice Dear Bell South, Yahoo, ! User. All the other things are exactly the same. They forgot to do. They didn't capitalize the Bell and Bell South. They didn't put the exclamation point by Yahoo. All the very same things that were in the last example. And again, the click here to upgrade. Don't click there. just go over it, look at it, and you'll see it's not legit. So the next example is they got even more. I guess more fancier is they fixed some other things. They said, okay, now we're going to direct it to, tell you that you're AT&T user. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, great, this might be the real email, except you look at it a little bit different. The subject line got fixed, great. To's line fixed. The from is still broken. You expand that from, it's still not right. The AT&T graphic, and this one I actually picked up on my iPhone, and the graphic was squashed. I'm thinking to myself, we will not ever send out a graphic that's not, 100%, perfect on probably every device you have, whether it's your phone or anything else like that. So it was actually squashed. So the graphic you might see, and I don't know how well it comes across in this display, but it's very squashed graphic and not normal. And again, everything from that point on is exactly the same errors. They didn't recognize that they made all those same, the same, I guess, tendencies of problems. So then we get the next one, and you think, okay, here's this great neat email, beautiful email. It's got all the AT&T graphics. It's got nice, pretty, colors, and looks very, very legitimate. And you're thinking, okay, so here's the real conversion email, and you think, okay, I'm all good. They fix whatever. I'm not a target. Well, guess what? You still are a target. Because again, same things happened before. The from, if you expand that, was not legitimate. It was just not good. You still see some of the other things. All users of AT&T, again, AT&T not capitalized, Yahoo not exclamation point, and will be barren. And we see that a lot of times in that individuals write these emails who maybe English is not their normal spoken language or not written language. They may choose wrong words or incorrect. They don't do that as much as they used to, but we still see it. And in this case, barren is was kind of a flag that, hey, this is not legit. Again, the click here to upgrade now, that's a link that actually would work. It would point you to the malware and to the phishing site. But again, if you mouse over it, you'll see that the site doesn't take you to an ATT.net or a Yahoo or any other ATT.com, any of the other legitimate websites. You would actually see that it was malicious. The other thing that kind of flagged me on this one when I looked at this, and you notice all the logos are all clean, all the proprietary statements are all clean. But the thing that kind of flagged me on this is if you mouse over these other links like communities, support, the troubleshoot, extra space between Go and paperless. All those links, none of those were legitimate links. And not only were they not legitimate links, but they didn't work. You could actually mouse over them or click on them, and they would not function. So in essence, they were just underlined words on this email. So the only link that was actually valid was the click here to upgrade now. Not necessarily what you'd always see, but it is something that you might. And again, this was definitely a phishing email.
Yeah, when you say valid, you didn't mean, I don't think, valid perhaps, but you mean that it worked.
And that's the way. But sometimes you'll see these emails, and I'm done for an example, but they'll actually have more links, but they'll still be the same ones that will point you to a phishing site. But in this particular example, all these blue highlighted items were just text.
Right.
So just like I said, I just wanted to share some things, and these all came within the course of about a week to my email, personal email address. The other thing that people can do, a little bit more advanced possibly, but is if you expand the headers and actually view the whole header, you can see, hey, this hopped through, international website or up to an international mail relay. It came, maybe a real, even a real source, which might be overseas or in a place that you think that's not quite real. Probably more than you need to do in these examples, but it might be on the more, as these get better and better, you might have to actually look and say, hey, did this come from an AT&T server, or did it actually originate on some server in outside the United States or outside the country of the origin of where your email is provided?
Right. Okay, so John, can you, if somebody gets an email like this, they suspect that it's not quite right, what do you suggest they do?
Well, the best case on an email, it's actually pretty simple. It is just there's two things that you want to do, and I'll speak to it from an AT&T perspective, and I've done it many times. Is the first thing you want to do is forward it to the abuse account, and AT&T's got a lot of abuse accounts. Just abuse ABUSE at att.net. That's probably the first thing you want to do. And it's a forward. Don't reply. Don't do anything. Don't reply to all and add it. You want to forward it. What I also recommend, and what they recommend as well, is that if you are comfortable looking at the mail headers, is that you copy those. So forward the email. But before you do that, look at the mail headers on the original email. Cut and paste them out. Then forward your email and copy those at the very top of the email and say, hey, and actually use some verbiage that says this is malicious. And then, of course, the third thing you should do is delete it. Very aggressively, delete it.
All right, good job there, John. Thank you very much. And, these are the kinds of things that's important. In fact, one of the things I kind of wonder here as you were going through it, if there was actually a little bit of training going on, that is to try to get someone warmed up to the fact that, or to see how many they would pick up with the cheesier kinds of scams, and then see if they could walk you in on the last one that's a little more convincing. But I think some time ago we even talked about cases where perhaps some of these phishing schemes are deliberately designed to be, a little bit flawed, so that they're really kind of picking the low-hanging fruit, ones that might be more easily scammed in other ways. But I don't know if that was the case here or not. It's a little hard to get inside the heads of the folks that are doing these types of activities.
And what amazed me, Brian, and I don't know why that it just so happened this way, but it was like I said, within the course of a week or less, I got 4 different examples, and it was almost this progression of getting better at how to send these. And so I kind of am worried that the next one that comes in, might not be quite so easy to see just because they are getting better.
Well, we should be on the lookout for it. All of us should be, and try to get any feedback of any cases that you find to be suspect, so that we can block those and remove those bad emails if possible. All right, thanks, John. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Internet weather for the week here, and we have a few items that have been taking place. One is, I think we talked about this before, this is a little bit of a revisit. It was actually a few weeks ago, and sort of a recurrence of activity, if you will. It relates to scan probes on port 1733 TCP. This is the point-to-point tunneling protocol, which I think actually this particular port is used for basically control of effectively GRE tunnels, if I understand correctly. But in any case, there were several IP addresses from China and the U.S. that are involved in this scanning activity. Most of the activity was from a particular address in China, which actually is kind of exhibiting different behavior than the others that were doing the scanning activity. And what I mean by that is it was also probing at least about 149 other ports between port 80 and 33,315 TCP. So lots of ports in that range that were being probed by the same IP address, and obviously one of those being 1733 TCP, which really showed up pretty clearly in the activity. So we saw that activity between, I guess it was July 23rd, extending up through July 26th, and it seems to have since kind of tapered off, but we should be paying attention to that, the possibility of abusing
Hey, Brian, did you think that the earlier spike was just them trying out the tool that they were using, or?
Well, it's certainly not unusual that to do some exploratory scanning to see if anything shows up and then decide whether they want to put in additional automation. And if you look kind of closely here, I say back around maybe July 19th or beginning on the 20th, it looked like there was some low-level activity that was picking up. That could have been, in fact, some testing activity of some automation tools to try to go into this a little bit deeper. But I don't have any, direct evidence that would be the case. Next item here is showed up in our activity as scan sources on port 53 UDP. Of course, we're seeing, regularly scanning activity on port 53 UDP. John talked a little bit earlier about the DNS reflection attacks or DNS amplification attacks. And, the attackers need to go out and find those DNS servers, the open DNS resolvers to perform those attacks. So I suspect most of this activity is related to that. But there's also a couple of events that took place, one on July 27th and one on July 28th, that were short but very much larger spikes of activity in terms of the number of sources. And this turns out to be related to backscatter from denial of service attacks. So I suspect the case is there were some type of queries or something being sent to attack targets, and it was being picked up in the response activities. It's not exactly clear what exactly was going on here, but it did sort of show up as indicator of backscatter from the denial of service attack. Next item here is scan sources and scan probes on port 5666 TCP. This is associated with Nagios, which is basically a system monitoring tool set that is to be able to monitor the status of CPU load, disk usage, that sort of thing on computers. And, that's one of these network management things or system management things that you don't really want to have exposed to the Internet, but clearly somebody is out there looking to see if there are some that are exposed. Kind of interesting here, there was a clear and abrupt uptick in the scan sources associated with this. Perhaps a botnet that they issued a command to go out and look for these particular, for servers on this particular port. And since then, it's sort of tapered off. This isn't particularly unusual. That is, what is likely happened is they issued a command. There might have been, perform this many probes associated with the command or something along those lines. And some systems are much quicker accomplishing all those probes, whereas other systems take longer, and it tapers off over time. Another possibility is there's some level of attrition associated with bots that are in a botnet like this, and they may have been discovered and taken out. So over the course of the last few days, the number of sources that are doing that scanning activity has tapered off, but it is continuing to take place. And I also want to mention is that the sources, it's on the order of about 200 plus sources that we've detected here. It's probably much larger than that network, internet-wide. They are widely distributed among predominantly what I would describe as hosting providers on a global basis. So it appears that these are web servers or at least hosted servers that are performing this probing activity, contrary or in contrast with perhaps clients or, consumers that might be infected. Next item here is increased bytes on source port 161 UDP, that's SNMP, and this is a continuation of SNMP reflection attacks. There's not much more to say about this. Nothing particularly notable in the last week or so, other than there are, occasional spikes in this activity. It shows up in our anomalies. And the next item here, scam probes on port 1521 TCP. This is the port for Oracle SQL access. And this is what we're seeing here is just a couple of source IP addresses in China. We started seeing, actually saw a spike in this activity back on July 8th, I think it was. And we've seen some spiky activity starting around July 16th. And it took a little bit of a sabbatical between the 21st and the 24th. And since then, seen some spiky activity taking place. So that's showing up on the radar in terms of anomalies, probing on that Oracle SQL port. So if you have an Oracle database, you want to pay attention to that.
Yeah, especially since Oracle just did their quarterly patches again. It's probably worth doing this graph over a year or so and see how often they spike right around the time that the patches come out.
Actually, quarterly events. Yeah, thanks, Jim. I'll try to make a note to do that for the next program. And then let's take a little bit look at the top 10 most probed ports. I don't see any particular surprises here. We'll walk through them really quickly. Port 445 as usual. Port 1433 TCP, that's Microsoft SQL database. 3389 TCP, that's remote desktop protocol. Port 53 UDP, we already talked about the scanning activity on DNS, looking for those open DNS resolvers. Port 8080 TCP, possibly looking for proxies that would be accessible. Port 443 TCP, possibly looking for perhaps exploitable vulnerabilities on SSL protected websites. I'm entertained by this scanning activity on port 135 TCP, which I thought we were over and done with, but apparently somebody feels that they need to take a look for some of the older Windows vulnerabilities. And then last but not least, port 22 TCP, that is typically password guessing on SSH. And we do have the one 16434 UDP, which is associated with the zero access botnet, which has been tapering down over time, but still is prominent. In terms of the most sources that are doing the probing, far and above the others is port 445 TCP. We also see activity on port 80 TCP, and there's some P2P activity here. This one probably innocuous, that is 27015 UDP, which is associated with gaming, and then the remainders are likely point-to-point or peer-to-peer activity associated with the zero-access botnet. That's the 16470, 16471, 16465, and 16464 UDP. And we can take a quick look at the daily reconnaissance index here. And what we're seeing is we saw a little bit of a spike in activity. I reported this a few weeks ago, a bit of a bump in the middle of July associated with some increase in scanning activity. But since then, it seems to be sort of returning to this sort of downward trend. In fact, it was particularly low this past week in terms of the number of probes and particularly the number of probes, and not so much in terms of the number of sources that are doing that probing. But it's good to see that we're seeing that downward trending in the amount of probing activity on the network. And I just thought we'd report to you, we have some folks attending the Black Hat conference this week that's taking place, and we're watching that activity for the possibility of some topics to discuss with you next week. So we want to encourage you to come back and discuss those or listen to what our discussions are about those and see if you have any of your own opinions you'd like to share with us as well. And on a final note, I'd like to just dedicate this program to Jim Boxmeyer. Jim has left us. He was a participant in this program on a couple of occasions and has passed away. So with that, that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ThreatTraq@list.att.com. You can also reach us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq, as well as on YouTube. You can also subscribe to audio-only version. It's available on iTunes. And thanks for joining us today. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and keep your network safe.